Most of my life, I thought forgiveness was something that I felt inside when I no longer was offended by somebody. But what forgiveness really is a decision that we make to release someone who has offended us into the hands of God. So Priscilla and I had to learn this, and today we're going to share with you what God showed us.
Hi, this is Phil and Priscilla Fretwell here with Savage Marriage.
We're going to talk about how God is healing and restoring marriages today from betrayal, addictions, and the wounds of their past.
And what he did in our marriage, he can do in yours too.
So, Priscilla, do you like forgiving?
Are you kidding me? This has been an issue in my life. I mean, for the longest time, right? It hasn't been until recently, 6 years ago, that I have figured out how not to hold resentment and unforgiveness towards people. Because I would just write them off and just say, you know what? I'm not talking to you anymore. Don't want to see you.
You know, I think it's part of our nature to want repayment.
Yeah,
Don't
very
you?
much. Yeah, very much so.
Yeah, it's so hard to let go because it really does take humility to do this.
It does. I mean, and that's one thing I had never seen in my life is humility and humbling myself before God.
You know, we had a situation just last week on this, didn't we?
We sure did. I had to ask for forgiveness twice last week.
So you want me to tell the story or?
Well, yeah, you can.
Okay. Well, so I mean, this isn't such a big deal, but we were trying to figure out what we wanted for dinner. We were at the store. You said you wanted
Snacks.
a snacks.
I don't want anything big. Just
my
some
my lunch
snacks.
my lunch wasn't so big, so I wanted like a dinner, and so I went out and picked up some meat to grill and some sweet potatoes and some stuff, and you said okay. So here I am in the kitchen trying to get the dinner made and everything, and so you know Becca said she only wants edamame, and then sooner or later you say
Me too. That's all I want.
and so I'm a little bit offended. You know, here I am, I'm making dinner, I'm trying hard, and both of you guys have come up. And so I'm like, why didn't you tell me earlier on this? So I've become a little bit offended, right? A little bit.
A little bit.
Yeah. And so a little bit of time comes by and you come to me and say,
I come by and I say, I'm sorry for how I made you feel.
yeah.
That you worked so hard and I kind of ignore it and don't really care for it.
And of course I said, how else did that make me feel? Right. So,
and then I'm searching for words.
And you're searching for words, right? And it's funny, even on this, we're trying to remember the story and you're struggling to remember the story because it wasn't that big of a deal to you, right?
No, I'm not the party that was offended.
That's right. I was the offended party. So I felt it a little more deeply in this. And of course I said, I forgive you. And then we hugged and kissed and made up, right? So some people have big offenses, much bigger than this, right?
Yeah, quite big.
And some have smaller offenses in this. But the thing that we wanted to bring up and talk about is that no matter what the offense, it does follow a similar format and template in going through this. And so we're going to talk about that today because this thing on unforgiveness, it's a prison.
It's a prison that we make of ourselves.
It really is. And if it'd be good to go back and look at Matthew 18. There's a well-known parable on this. And you've got three players in this parable. You've got a king, you have a debtor, and then you've had somebody that owes the debtor money. And in this situation, the king asks the debtor to pay him back. The debtor can't, and the king's going to throw him in prison. The debtor then begs the king for mercy. The king gives him mercy. And then the debtor goes out and demands that somebody else repays him. And the king finds out about it and is appalled. And he says in this parable, I'm shortcutting a lot of this, but of the debtor, he says, now throw him into prison until he repays everything. And it's something like be subject to the torturers. There's the word that torturers is in there. And I remember when we read that the first time, we said, man, this unforgiveness is like you're being tortured.
Right. It's something that you live with day in and day out, and you can't get out of it.
You can't.
You can't. You're just stuck in this torment of unforgiveness.
That's right. And so this is something we think is pretty important to talk about today. Yeah. And so some of you are going, you know, you guys, you don't understand what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with big stuff in our marriage. Yeah. You're talking about not cooking dinner. Right?
I'm talking about my husband running off on me.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's big. It's the betrayal and the despair that people are going through is huge. It
It
really
is.
is. And we deal with this in every relationship that we have, not only with spouses, but with our kids, with our work coworkers, everyone. We are dealing with this relationship of forgiveness and unforgiveness. And some of the stuff is huge.
It
And
is.
some of the stuff is just so simple and so like seriously. But I will tell you, 6 years ago, it was huge for us.
Mhm.
And 6 years ago, we saw God come in and supernaturally change our relationship. For the people who are listening, God is in this. And we just have to be able to take our hands and open, release what is happening unto Him because He's going to work this out in a supernatural way.
Well, I think the thing that we've seen is whether the offense is big or small, the template for forgiveness remains the same, right?
It does. It's a roadmap that God has given us in His Word, and it doesn't change.
Yeah.
It's always the same. The template does not change.
It requires a humility to forgive, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, God is very clear in His Word. It is a possibility to forgive. It's an infinite amount of times. It does
Mhm.
not cease.
And it mirrors his forgiveness for us, right? His
Right.
forgiveness for us is unending. There is
Thank God it's unending because we
yes,
are screw ups here.
right. Yeah, and I think the thing that makes it so possible here is when we start seeing what God has forgiven us of, our ability to extend forgiveness now is magnified. But without that, we're back to natural forgiveness. And forgiveness is not natural.
No, it's not. It's a supernatural thing that God has displayed for us on the cross. He displays it every day. And it's really waiting on Him to come in as we release these things that we hold tight to. We humble ourselves before Him, and He does amazing things with that.
And so in our humility, we can say, God, I forgive him or I forgive her because you forgave me. The thing that keeps us from forgiving is we look at the offense toward us and we say, oh, that is so much bigger than my offenses. Their sin is huge and our sin is small. But God is saying, hey, it's all sin, right? I've forgiven you. You have the ability to extend the forgiveness to somebody else. So, with that, I think what we've seen is there's this forgiveness template, and we want to share just a few points with everybody today on things that we've seen in forgiveness. This worked out, I think, in our marriage as well, but we see it working in many other people's lives as well. Just going to kind of run through 4 points here or so for you and give you some thoughts on that. So, what's the first one?
Well, the first one would be you should know what you are forgiving.
You have a
Yeah.
right to know, right?
Everyone has the right to know. So it's not necessarily like, oh, I'm so sorry I was unfaithful to you and that I betrayed you. It's like, what did you do? What were the actions that you took upon yourself to betray me? I want to know.
Yeah, we are aware that in some settings that a counselor will tell somebody in a disclosure setting. So let's say one spouse is disclosing to the other spouse, a formal disclosure. Here's all the things I have done to betray you and hurt you. But the offended spouse can't actually ask any questions. In other words, the counselor is trying to set a very safe environment for the person making the disclosure, which means there will be no questions asked. But in that setting, Priscilla, what happens to the person that can't ask any questions?
I think their imagination takes off
Yeah,
on what it was that he or she did, and it becomes full blown in their minds what happened
yeah,
without ever knowing the truth.
right. Yeah, I'm reminded of a couple one time. The disclosure the guy made to his family actually was he had been involved in some immoral sexual behavior and he left it. And
That's
that
all
was
he
it.
said. That's all he said.
And then he got cut off from his grandkids and everything else. And in that setting, if that's the disclosure, your mind runs to the worst, right? What does that mean,
Yeah.
sexual immoral behavior? And you don't want to tell me any details. Yeah, it's a terrifying thing, right?
It is. I mean, in that instance, the kids who were adults and they had children said, "My kids will not be at your house anymore.
Yeah, because they don't know what it's about.
You didn't tell me."
Their minds went to the worst, is what, and I'm sure people on this podcast can imagine where your mind would run to in a setting like that, right?
Right.
And so we've always said that you have a right to know. So part of this, Priscilla, is that the Bible says that my body actually doesn't belong to me. It belongs to you, and vice versa. Yours belongs to me. So if I do something immoral with my body, you have a right to know because it's not mine, it's yours, right? I've used it inappropriately. And when I don't tell you, then your mind runs to all sorts of things. And so, what can actually happen is if you don't get down to the details, and let's say that I confess something to you, you don't have all the details, and you forgive me. And in 2 years, you find out another significant detail about what happened that you weren't aware of. Now, what happens? What do you feel now?
I think it all comes flooding back. The despair, the discouragement, the lies, they all come flooding back because I did not know the truth.
Yeah.
I did not know the details, and there wasn't any like clarity. This is what happened. This is what I did. This is how I did it.
And then what do you think about other things that you've not known about?
Right. Then all the questions like, okay, what about all the other stuff? Exactly. What did you, all the other stuff you confessed? You never gave me details.
Yeah. So we're right back to the starting point.
Yes. And that's not
Of
a,
this.
that's a very discouraging place to be. Actually.
That's where bitterness can take over again,
Yeah. And
unforgiveness, anger, all this stuff fled back in. So you have a right to know what you're forgiving, and you have a right to ask questions and get those questions answered. And it's to both parties' benefits, right? I mean, from my standpoint, I didn't want you to find out about something else that occurred later that you didn't know about. I wanted you to fully know what it was that I was asking you to forgive me for. So there couldn't ever be this sense of what else might be lurking around out there. So yeah, Priscilla, it took us a while to process the details, you know?
It sure did. I mean, it probably took almost 6 months to say, let's go through everything and talk about it in detail and just elaborate on everything and dissect everything.
Yeah. So that's really our first point. You know, if you're forgiving, let's know what you're forgiving for, and you have a right to know that. The second point here is that, you know, your forgiveness isn't based on somebody else's apology.
If you're going to wait for someone to apologize, you might be waiting your whole life.
Now, you might be saying, Phil, isn't this the opposite of kind of what you just said? You need to know the details and all this type of stuff. And yeah, I mean, you do want to know details. You do want to know this, but the problem is that unforgiveness is your prison, not his or hers. It's your prison that you live in. And you might be in a situation you never get an apology from somebody, and you long for an apology, but it's never there. So in that setting, I mean, what do you think? Can we still forgive?
I think we can still forgive. Yes, definitely. Most definitely, you can forgive the person who has hurt you, has offended you, who abused you. It doesn't mean that you're having a relationship with them. I mean, a lot of times you hear of a person dying, right, who abused you. It does not mean that you cannot forgive them. You can.
I think it's one of the real confusing points here because people equate forgiveness to reconciliation, don't they?
Yes.
And it's not the same.
No, I mean, we use the terminology of forgiveness is a one-way street. Reconciliation is a
Yeah.
two-way street.
Yeah. Forgiveness opens the door to reconciliation, but doesn't guarantee it.
Right.
So, in this setting where you are forgiving without receiving an apology, it's something that you're doing for you. You know, I feel like I had to do some of that with my dad, you know, in the divorce and his behaviors. He's married 7 times, all this type of stuff. You know, there was a release that I had to do for my dad in this setting, even though I probably never got the type of apology I really wanted to from him. But I had to be able to release that, and I was, because it was based on God has forgiven me, so I can forgive him. What about the third point here, Priscilla?
Forgiveness is by faith, and it is supernatural. I
Yeah.
know that in my life, it was something that God worked over days and weeks of me coming before him, wanting to forgive you of everything that you had done in the past 28 years, not necessarily just your double life, but in the 28 years of marriage, and coming before the Lord and saying, Lord, I want to forgive him just like you forgave me.
Mm-hmm.
Because the Lord had forgiven me. I was a very bitter, angry, apathetic person towards God. And he forgave me for living all of my life like that, 50 some years of that.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, no, I forgive you.
Yeah.
So when God has forgiven me, how can I not forgive someone who has offended me like you?
Yeah. The other piece of this, I'd say the natural forgiveness, right? If we can call it that, is I'm going to forgive when I feel like it.
Right.
Right.
Or when you pay me back everything you owe.
That's right.
Which there can never be.
Yeah. And I mean, settings like a betrayal and infidelity. I mean, how do you pay back for that? Right. How do you get a payback on that? And so many times say, I'll forgive when I feel like forgiving him, or when I feel like he's earned it, or he's paid enough penance, right? And we see situations like that where an offending partner works themselves to death trying to please the other spouse, cooks dinners and meals and buys things and all this type of stuff. And the offended spouse really never lets go.
No. And actually, they remind them.
Yeah, remind them, you need to do all that, right? So
Yeah.
there can never be a payback in this, and there has to be a complete release. But it is a supernatural thing that God does. I don't know that we do this. Forgiveness is not natural for us. Natural is we want payback and we want to hold into account. And that's where we are naturally. So it has to be something that we really release ourselves to the Holy Spirit to come back in and work this through ourselves.
And the last one, I believe, is forgiveness starts with your mouth, in the sense of you start proclaiming, you start speaking words of forgiveness, you start speaking to this mountain of unforgiveness and saying, no, I will forgive my husband.
Yeah.
I might not feel it, but I will forgive him because Jesus has forgiven me. I will forgive you.
So that is so hard for people to grasp. I think what you're saying right now, that it's going to come out of my mouth before I feel it.
Yeah, this supernatural forgiveness comes also with a blessing. This person that you want to forgive, God wants you to forgive, and he's going to do it through you, is actually praying for that person.
Yeah.
And I remember praying for you.
Mm.
God, you brought him through so much of this coming clean, and I know you've forgiven him, and I want there to be a blessing on us.
Yeah.
It's just something so simple, right? Pray for the person who has abused you.
Yeah.
Release them into the hands of God.
Yeah.
God's supernatural forgiveness leads us to not have resentment or bitterness or payback from that person.
Yeah. I mean, it's a question that we get a few times from people, when we get into a setting like this, is how do I know? I think I've forgiven him or her. How do I know? And we always run through a couple of things there. I mean,
right. Well, one is and this was really big for me, and not just with your relationship, but with relationships with other people that I have, was when you mention them, like that angst kind of rises up in you and says, I just don't like that person.
Yeah, it's a sign of unforgiveness,
It's a
right?
sign of unforgiveness. Why do you feel that way every time their name is mentioned?
Because you really need to be able to talk about that person without the emotion, right? If you still get that emotion, that angst that's rising up in your soul every time you see a picture of them or hear their name, it's a sign.
It's a sign. Yep.
Yep, it is a sign.
Another one that I have seen displayed in my life is to be able to tell others that this is what happened between my husband and I, and there was healing and there was forgiveness.
Yeah.
And that to me was huge. And not to have any resentment or bitterness, and actually be able to testify of God has come in and done a work.
Yes.
Not only in his life, but in my life.
Yeah. Well, it really runs to another thought on this, is that, do you now feel like you don't need to keep the offense secret?
Yes.
This idea that we have to keep all these offenses secret, it really runs many cases either back to a shame or an unforgiveness or a bitterness somewhere, right? But you know that when you get to the place that you are no longer guarding the secret, the big family secret, right? You've gotten to a place of release in your life. You're not in shame about it. You're not in unforgiveness about it. And it really is a place of healing.
One other thought is looking at this person who is the offender and wanting to see what happened to them.
Yeah.
What happened to them? What was the trauma that they went through?
You're really trying to understand their story.
That's right. Instead of saying, why did you do this to me?
Because, forgiveness and compassion go hand in hand, don't they?
They do.
And whenever you see somebody else's story and you start to now understand a little bit about it, all of a sudden you can feel the compassion that will help this forgiveness well up in your soul.
Yes, I know that with my own story of sexual abuse, once I understood the story of my abuser, it became like, "Oh, that's why this happened."
Well, all these things are really designed to figure out, is there somebody that I need to let go of? Is there somebody I need to forgive? If you get an apology, that's fantastic. But we don't want you to live in a prison of unforgiveness just because somebody hasn't felt the need to apologize to you. And so if there's somebody like that, we would encourage you to let the words come out of your mouth. Just like Priscilla said, wake up in the morning and say, I forgive John, or I forgive Sally, or whoever it is, and let that come out of your mouth. And Lord, I am trusting you for the feelings to follow in this.
Another thing that, I know you and I have both found useful, and that is to write out our story. And I know that you wrote your story out to me of things that you held on with unforgiveness.
Hmm.
And I know that with my abuse, I wrote out my story to you, and
Hmm.
it was very healing. It wasn't just a fact, "Oh, this happened to me," but it was actually our stories written out.
Yeah. And winding up with at the end of the story, and I forgive
My abuser.
my abuser right in this.
Yeah.
Well, both of these things are important, right? It's bringing words and it's bringing thoughts instead of just having feelings, right? Because God is all about the word. He communicated to us through the word, and he expects that and allows us to experience the same thing as we give word to the feelings and the thoughts that he has given us. So Priscilla, this is like a tag team to our last one that we did on apologies, right? And
Yes, so
because
long ago too.
yeah, but it's the two big keys in a marriage, I think,
It
don't you?
is, very much so.
The apologies linked to a repentance and then a forgiveness. I will tell you, if couples can get these two things right in their marriage, they can have lots of success moving forward, don't you think?
I believe so.
This is Phil and Priscilla Fretwell. Thanks for listening. Our book, Savage Marriage: Triumph Over Betrayal and Sexual Addiction, is now available on Amazon.
Follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Savage Marriage Ministries. Also, join our Savage Marriage community at savagemarriageministries.com.
And remember, it's God who is at work in your savage adventure.